So Anne, as I always ask, it'd be great if you can just give us a quick overview of Anne Johnson and what's taken you from the delights of Banff to the delights of Santa Clara, Anne.
So I was born in Glasgow, but my parents moved when I was 1 to the Fordland near Turriff, which some of you may know. And then they both taught at Banff Academy. And so my brother and I went to school at Banff Academy rather than Turriff. And then I did my first degree in economics in Aberdeen and my second degree in what became informatics, but was then a combination of the artificial intelligence department, the computer science department, and the electrical engineering department at Edinburgh. So I'm fundamentally Scots based. And of course, as with a lot of people from that era, there was no prospect of having any kind of interesting technology job in Scotland at that point. And so I moved to Hemel Hempstead, near where Christine lives now, and then back to Edinburgh, and then to Hewlett Packard at South Queensferry in the era when HP was at South Queensferry. So that dates me, for those of you who know Edinburgh. And from HP at South Queensferry, I moved to Bristol when HP were setting up their labs. For the first time, they were setting up a remote lab from the Palo Alto base. And that was the point at which I came across Cisco Systems, because when Cisco had 15 employees and were a very small new company, HP was its first commercial customer, and we installed Cisco routers in the labs in Bristol. And long story short, after a little while, Cisco asked me to move to their newly appointed reseller in London. That was my first experience of a startup, moving from a big company to a small company. And I was the CTO for that reseller and systems integrator. I built a team of service people there. And from there, I realized that all the interesting things that were happening in the world were happening in Silicon Valley. And so I talked to Sequoia Capital, who had been the investor in Cisco Systems. And Doug Leone pointed me at a couple of the people in whom they had invested. And I joined a startup in Palo Alto. And then after 18 months, Cisco Systems bought the startup. So that was how I ended up not only coming to the Valley, but having a career in the Valley. And then things moved on from there. So I've done a mixture of big companies and small companies. At Cisco, one of the things that I did was do technical due diligence for the companies whom Cisco acquired, and Cisco acquired a lot of companies.
Yeah.
And so that gave me experience in coaching startups and financing startups, in addition to having worked for them. So that'll do. There's always more to the story, but that'll do.
It's a great start for the story. Now, Anne, I'm just going to point out there's a little bit of interference coming through. I think you may have your, have you got the microphone just yes, just a little bit of interference, and I know
does that help?
That's perfect, Anne.
Okay.
That's super great. So, and that fascinating background and the number of years that you have been established out in Santa Clara, you have seen quite a few changes in your time over in the Valley. The question I always ask, and in this case, again, I can picture you looking out the window and you're in a somewhat residential area. But Anne, what is the picture outside your window, and some of the changes you noted recently in your blog, particularly around the lack of traffic and delivery models? What's it looking like out your window today?
Well, we have beautiful California sunshine for a start. And let's see. So I look out onto San Antonio Road, which is an interesting measure of traffic. So just since that blog post was written, the traffic volume has gone up. There was a report on the radio this morning. There's a local to California, local to Northern California, which is still an enormous area, of traffic actually backing up again for the first time on one of the notorious passes that comes in from the East Bay. So even though the lockdown has been extended to the end of May, we're starting to see a pickup in just movement of people. Now, what that's going to do to the caseload for the coronavirus, goodness only knows. Everybody's very much feeling their way as to what changes we should expect and at what's the right balance between taking the lockup off and getting business going again. But in terms of Los Altos, we're seeing some retail activity. The restaurants have, some of them have shut and some of them have converted to doing takeout only. The regular retail stores have shut and may or may not be able to reopen again. But there's also examples of completely idiotic fear-mongering. So I saw a report that came from our local town council, which should know better, that said, well, there's these businesses that are actually open for business because they were open for retail trade. And they completely ignored the fact that at least 50 or 60% of the businesses that they didn't count are actually working from home. So there's a huge number of office-based offices around here, and they're all closed. But it's not that people aren't working. So Cerebras, who are one of the people building what they claim is the biggest chip in the world, are my next door neighbor. And there's no, maybe one car in their car park of an evening sometimes, but I know they're working because there's a big chiller that runs that I can hear. And they've got themselves rigged up like so many people. They've got equipment at home, their developers are at home, and they're all continuing to work while they can. And people are finding new ways of working in a very much more quickly than they would otherwise have been inclined to.
And we kind of assume that America's always at the forefront of new ways of working, of different ways of doing things, Anne. But this movement where the majority of individuals who can work from home are working from home, has that been an easy shift within the West Coast, or has there, as there has been here in the UK, quite a cultural shift for us?
Well, so for the technology business, it's very straightforward. Everybody's used to doing video conferences. Everybody's used to doing conference calls. It occurred to me to think a couple of weeks ago that my very first video conference was in 1987. So, I've seen many evolutions of the technology. And the other thing that is enormously useful is that the network infrastructure has stood up to the very significant change in the way that people are using it. Mm-hmm. Now, what has been different is that people who would never otherwise have basically got themselves through the barrier of working remotely have started to work remotely. I volunteer for a charity that I'm the treasurer of, which has been in existence 50 years, and most of its volunteers are retired. And 3/4 of them, the first time, took part in a Zoom board meeting. And they would never have even contemplated doing that if it hadn't been for this emergency. So there's, for the people in the technology business, it's business as usual. For other people, it's a big change. And you can tell the difference.
And that big change, Anne, do you see, I mean, your background is, as you said, around informatics and data and technology. Do you, from your informed view, see that this big change will continue when we move out of lockdown, when the world starts coming out of this global lockdown from trade and individuals?
Yes. So, like a lot of people who've been thinking about this for a while, there's no way that we're going back to how things were in January, February. That's gone. What we need to think about is what the new normal is going to be. And you look at the airline business. GE laid off 10,000 people from their engine plant yesterday. They and British Airways and Virgin and all the other airlines, they can't see when there's going to be a resumption of travel that's going to get them to anywhere like the business that they had. Not going to happen. The other big thing is that people have realized that it's much more efficient if people work in their houses at least part of the time.
Yeah.
And the whole sensation that people have about how to manage remote working and how to collaborate remotely is going to potentially, I think highly likely, make a drastic difference to the property market. So people are going to want to be able to adapt their home spaces better for long-term office use. And the office buildings that people are building need to be able to be changed so that people, when people do go there, they can work together, but in a way that's going to be safe, because we're not going to have safe working where people can be next to each other until we get a vaccine or resistance, and there's no prospect of that inside 18 months. So those are just two big changes.
Yeah.
Then there's Hollywood, for example. Hollywood is completely shut down, and it's not going to be able to come back. The noises people are making about how Hollywood could get back to doing scenes where two people interact. They're going to have to go to green screens. They're going to have to go to simulations. They're going to have to drastically change, much more in line with what the gaming business is doing.
Fascinating, Anne, because these are topics, and that particular one that you spoke about there about the property side of things. I mean, we know already as some of our members have moved out of the WeWork space because their business model has changed. And I think, this whole collaborative working, which was seen as the great utopia up until now, and bringing all these different individuals together, that is going to have to change. But what, as you say, business continuing, but not the new normal. And we're going to, I think, have to go through a number of shifts before we start settling into whatever the new normal is.
Yep, there's going to be a lot of experimentation.
Yeah. And another point that you raised in your blog, and you're very kind to share that with me before, I was going to speak to you about the commercial and the business situation in the West Coast, and you spoke about a piece where they talked about the great unwinding, and you mentioned that businesses are being wound up in greater numbers than has been before, and even than we saw during the dot-com business. Could you elaborate a wee bit more on that piece of research that you referred to, Anne?
So, of course, people being laid off and businesses being wound up doesn't get nearly as much publicity because people are reluctant to talk about it and people are reluctant to participate. But in some ways, there's what is being recognized as a flight to quality. So people who were in a vulnerable situation with respect to their cash flow, people who didn't raise funds so that they can continue operating for 2 years, and people whose business model is no longer viable. I mean, anybody starting a business now, or 6 weeks ago, to pay attention to the travel business needs to stop. So there's always a flow of businesses being unwound, and I completely, it seems perfectly plausible that the guy who was talking about basically running bankruptcies and laying people off and getting rid of furniture and all that kind of thing, that seems perfectly plausible that volume has gone up. Now, in some ways, it's healthy because there's been a big bubble in, WeWork's a lovely example. SoftBank should never have invested all of that money. SoftBank has had its comeuppance in a way that people who were experienced in the business could see coming. But there was a stage when you couldn't argue against an investment that SoftBank had made. But now you can. Now an investment from SoftBank is a alarm call, not a positive thing. And so there's been a lot of wasteful investment. The VCs are having a big wake-up call where, to start with, they're having to support their existing businesses in which they've made investments, or they're doing a basically, what GE used to call rang and stack, and going through them and saying, look, we can't support you anymore. This is going to have to stop. So every so often you get a shakeout, and boy, is this a shakeout.
Yeah, and you and I think it was either through Twitter and social media, particularly around that piece around Save Our Startups, and there was quite a lot of dialogue here in the UK, and you and I were kind of going back and forth on that. What has been the state or the the federal situation around saving startups and the VC community in the West Coast? Has there been government intervention there, as there has most recently been in the UK?
So the US is a big country, and you have to differentiate between federal and state. But taking federal first, there has been support offered for companies who have employees. And I know personally of 2 companies where they have applied for and have been told that they have been approved for employee support for employees, to the extent, to one of them, for more than $1 million, but they haven't received the money yet. So the federal government is an interesting animal. In the state, there's been some support, and also primarily support for things like the medical system. So the critical thing for California, there was enormous alarm early because Santa Clara, it turned out, had the very first deaths from COVID-19. There was enormous concern that the healthcare system was going to be overwhelmed, just like the concern for the National Health Service in Britain. And so there were emergency hospitals stood up, there were sports centers converted into health centers, into places where you could do quarantine. And so far, that hasn't really been required. There's been regular reporting, there's been sufficient cases that people are rightly concerned and willing to stay at home. Now we start the unwinding. Now we get to see whether we get a big spur in the cases, or whether we get to continue business. But that was the principal form of support. And there's been also support for people who've been laid off in terms of just money grants and things of that sort. California has a lot of people who are undocumented. They are basically illegal immigrants, but they are taxpayers, and the federal government doesn't offer any support to people like that, but the state does. So you get that kind of contrast.
And where do you think, from the VC community, Anne, will there be, I mean, it hasn't come to a halt, there is still investments ongoing, but do you feel that there will be a far greater level of due diligence in these investments going forward, particularly around robustness and resilience of a business going through? Because until we find a vaccine, we could be in this closed down hammer situation for a period of time. Will there be specific sectors that you think will have greater attractiveness for investors going forward, or will the focus be around robustness and resilience across all sectors?
Well, there's going to be a clear out. Like I said, there are certain sectors where it makes no sense to continue having investments. On the other hand, there are sectors where it's going to be much more attractive for VCs to invest. So things like you can get a good indication of the things that are going to be positive by looking at the public markets. So you look at PayPal, you look at Shopify, you look at Amazon. All of those people, Amazon for Amazon Cloud, Microsoft's doing very well. So the big infrastructure guys are going to come out of this very positively. So people who are financing things that the big infrastructure guys are going to want to acquire in the medium term, that's a good place to invest. The people who are not going to be making investments are things like commercial companies. So what we call strategic investment. The commercial companies are busy sorting out their own business. They're not in a situation to make investments in startups. So the guys we get flight to quality again. The guys who have experience and lots of resources are going to carry on investing quietly. There's going to continue to be investment in hardware. So if we're going to have the things like Cerebras I mentioned, GraphCore, the people who build hardware specifically for data analysis and for use in the big data centers, all of that kind of thing is going to continue. Partly because you don't want to stop it because these things have a long range on them, and partly because you want to be able to be sure that you do have access to new technology that's going to support the new normal. Yeah. But there's going to be things that particularly angel investors, people making investments into second round, as soon as when the markets are as uncertain as they are, people don't want to put their resources into things that they have no idea whether they're going to pay off or not. So people would rather hold on to their cash as individuals or as Series A investors. There's getting refinanced at Series B is going to be much tougher than it was before. Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to be sure that I said is that for people to understand that for Scotland specifically, because you asked about this when we were exchanging email. Yeah. The big change that is relevant to Scotland is that it's much more globally competitive than ever it was. So if you're making a pitch, you are competing with everybody else in the world who can make a pitch on video. And there's nothing location specific about your pitch to the VCs. So that's both good and bad. You aren't at a disadvantage because you've got jet lag, you're just at a disadvantage because of the time of day, if anything. But you are competing with people from Israel, you're competing with people from the Valley, you have to be conscious that the market is global in a way that it's in some ways never been before.
Yeah, yeah. a great point, Anne, and thank you for that, because we are shifting into a completely new normal with this. So the funding is still available, but the pitch has to be relevant and right for the audience here. And just moving on to that point, Anne, about global trade for Scottish businesses. As you know, we published a report with Momentous Change earlier this year of perceptions of Scots as exporters. What do you feel in this current climate we should be cognizant of for Scotland as a trading nation, and for our those who are listening to this webinar, for Scots as exporters? What should we be prepared in?
Well, Brexit has scared everybody. And so one of the things that you're going to have to be able to answer is, in the event of Brexit happening, what is your trading position going to be? So if we can no longer rely on the trading agreements that were pertinent for the EU, how are trade terms, how are trade agreements, how are professional licenses, all of the things that affect the ability of people physically located in Scotland to do business with the rest of the world, how are those going to be managed? And that is one of these critical things. So for example, have any of you, you don't need to answer this right now, but there is the California Consumer Privacy Act. This is about to come into effect. It took effect in January 2020, and it is fundamentally incompatible with people doing business in China. So the Chinese have rules about data being made available to the Chinese government. California has made a set of rules about data privacy. And it's not the same as GDPR. It's the same kind of idea, but has a different effect. If you haven't investigated that particular law, you need to go look at it and understand the consequences and decide how you're going to arrange your trading data and how you're going to balance the relationship between China and California. That's an interesting challenge.
And a couple of things, and I just have to keep the thread of our webinars going here, but 2 weeks ago I was interviewing those Scots based in Germany, and I got a very clear telling of Brexit has actually happened, and so, but the fact is we haven't agreed the trading terms. So I always they were very clear with me on that. But just picking up on that point, Anne, that is invaluable information which we are very fortunate to get from you, because you're a Scot on the ground and you understand the opportunities here. Where would you best point Scots who are seeking to develop their trade in, and I know it cleared you clearly what you're saying, the US is a large country with different federal and states details that we need to be cognizant of. But for those coming into California, is there a database or links or whatever that you would point us towards as exporters to say, keep an eye on that, that will keep you right in the new normal and legislatively?
Well, I would have to go look to see what something like Scottish Development International or Scottish Enterprise provide.
Sure.
I haven't been concerned with people who are doing physical export, other than briefly looking at the regulations for food, which are complicated because I have I would like to be able to buy certain foods, and the rules for exporting food are interesting. So I've been paying a whole lot more attention to what it takes to actually do business as a software development organization. And for that, any of the big law firms are the places, Cooley, for example, they have getting started kits, and their getting started kits are much the same for anybody coming in from other states in the US. They don't specifically have much for people coming in from outside, except that there's one guy from Wilson Sonsini who I know
Yeah.
who writes about how you get started in the Valley. I did a bunch of write-up work 5-7 years ago now that says this is how to get started in the Valley, but I haven't updated that for a while. It's not straightforward, and things that people fall over things like health insurance. It's so different, and employer provided health insurance is both very expensive and difficult to do, and it's one of these things where if you don't do it right, you get yourself into legal difficulties and registration difficulties and all sorts of problems that affect your employees too. So there isn't a good answer to that question that I know of. Sorry.
But I know the Wilson Sonsini with gentleman, his name's just gone right out of my head, who works between US and London and does some great work, and they've got a lot of webinars going on at the moment around trade between the two, so I'll put details up on that in our members database. Just two final questions from me, and I know our participants, we've got a good number of participants online today, but so if any questions you want to put through, please use the chat function, and I'm happy to take those. But advice from your global expertise, your understanding of trading globally, and particularly in the US, and what advice would you give us as Scottish companies seeking to go global, and how best should we be mitigating the negative economic impact which is happening now and may continue for a period of time?
Well, one of the nasty side effects is that people need to preserve their cash position. And one of the ways to be competitive is to be able to say, for this resource requirement, supposing that we're talking about making developing some piece of software, for this resource requirement, here are the people that I know to whom I have access. Here is my cash position. I know that I'm going to be able to support these people while we do the development that you're asking for. So confidence in your liquidity, and this is back to the point that you were making earlier on about reliability. You need to be able to convince people that you're going to continue to be in business, and don't make light of that as a strength to be exhibited, because if the company appears to be too fragile, people are going to say, I'm sorry, I can't expose myself as a customer to the risk that you're not going to be there. So that would be the fundamental thing. And it's not something that's Scottish specific, but it's something that everybody's going to have to do.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be invited into a webinar with Mervyn King, ex-governor of the Bank of England, and the two things he said that will be paramount in any business going forward and how people view you as a business is your robustness and your resilience, not just during this current pandemic, but going forward. That is how robust and how resilient a management team and the business is will be what is viewed as credible going forward, Anne.
Right, and what that implies is a lot of the small businesses that I've interacted with and seen startups, particularly in Scotland, need to think really hard about whether they shouldn't combine in some way in order to have a bigger and more plausible business. So people who got, 2 to 3 to 10 employees and a restricted idea that's very specific might be better off coming to basically combining, having companies acquire do acquisitions or mergers or something like that, where you get to something that is fundamentally at a bigger scale than a lot of the ideas that tend to get support and emerge from the universities and then carry on for too long and at small scale.
Yeah, yeah. Couple of questions coming in, and I'm just going to pick up on first
Yep.
one. Eddie, I'm not just clear about your question there. If you could just come back to me on the question again. Katrina talking about collaboration being a major factor going forward, and certainly that was coming out in your update there, Anne. One of our members, Tweedy Brown, I'm just going to read it out. Tweedy's involved.
It's all right. I've got it.
You've got it as well.
Yep.
So is that going to be the same, Anna, around renewables, clean energy going forward?
Well, that's a whole other thing. So coincident with the virus shutdown, and I'm sure that the Russians didn't plan to have their price war about supply of oil coincide with a total energy demand shutdown. And of course that's upset the oil price, and that's upset everybody's view of what's going to happen to energy demand, and therefore the use of polluting fuels. So it's not clear yet. There's a point of view that says that because oil is suddenly cheap, there'll be a big upsurge in the use of it. There's a point of view that says that because travel is going to continue to be restricted, the demand side of the oil price is, and therefore the oil use and therefore the pollution as a consequence, is going to be much reduced. And there's a whole very hopeful piece of the environmental and travel and energy users forums that I follow eagerly, which has to do with electronic bicycles and scooters and electric vehicles, that says that there's an opportunity for a long-term shift. People are shutting down streets in major cities because people want to be able to walk and not drive. So I don't know. Ask me in 3 months, ask me in 6 months. But the way that you can tell is you watch the people who are doing satellite images of the of pollution. Those things are the key data indicators to what's happening, and that the use of that data for indicating economic activity and indicating air pollution is not going away. I do know that the sky over Los Altos is markedly clearer since the shutdown. We've got much better views of the mountains, and you realize just how much air pollution there has been because you can see the mountains all day instead of there being a haze by mid-afternoon.
Yeah. And I am kind of obsessed by two apps at the moment. One is Flight Radar, and the other one is the City Mapper Index, which just shows how many flights are in the air, although a lot of them are FedEx and DHL, and the City Mapper Index to show what is the movement across any city. And I think I must take screenshots of them because they are great indicators as to really what's happening globally at the moment, and the movement or lack thereof. Eddie's just come back around the point about large companies v small and agile businesses. So this may be an opportunity about shaking out about the big and small, and we're picking up that around the unwinding. And we're also question coming in there around improving resilience. Are you seeing an increased demand, or do you feel we'll see an increased demand for consultancy and software services?
Well, not yet. So the trouble with resilience is that people don't know how to do it. And they don't know how to measure it, and they don't know how to quantify it. So people are very bad at understanding risk and understanding the trade-off between more resilience and better business. So until there is a way of having people understand that, and maybe the key to it is things like insurance. You need an insurance market that which is where this kind of risk trade-off usually happens. What I am seeing is a big increase in computing security specifically. So the whole, as part of cloud networking, as part of resilience of networks and availability, that piece there's significant interest in, and also, of course, lots of attacks. The whole cybersecurity space has had to step up its game drastically because there's been a lot of attacks on networks, attacks on ransom, that kind of malign misbehavior that goes along with any kind of disaster.
And you mentioned at the start about the fact you served in a charity and you managed to get them all on to Zoom, but with Jackie Malloy as a fundraiser, has been an extremely successful fundraiser for a Glasgow-based charity. And just Jackie's asking about the impact in charities in the USA, the overall philanthropy then, is my question around that. Has there been more of a hunkering down, or do you think this global support around charities will still be there, and particularly for those that are out with the US of A?
Well, there's been a rapid response from the big charities. So Bill and Melinda Gates are the absolute epitome of this. And so they have swiveled their activity to supporting vaccine development. I've seen similar things from some of the other big charities. The Packard Foundation is local to Los Altos. They came out of Hewlett Packard. They've been providing money to there's also been, at the much smaller scale, there's been a big swing in people providing basic food support for people who are unemployed. So that has gone on. There's interest in the local charities in Los Altos. There's been a big swing in how can we support people who don't have enough food because they can't afford to buy it anymore. So that continues. The charitable, the wish to be charitable, the wish to help, the impetus to help is going to carry on. And the basic question is, can people be organized? Just like any, this doesn't change, just the impetus to it changes. The problem with charities is, how do you actually measure the effective delivery rather than the people who are involved in the charity because they like being involved in the charity for the sake of being involved in the charity. And there's this tension that is fundamental to charity activity.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Anne. My final question, Anne, and I mean, literally, we've had a captive audience here today. We've had no drop off, Anne, and a great deal of interest in what you're saying. You see that coming through in the chat. I'm just going to pick up on this question from Letty. It would be unfair not to. London Scottish House, phenomenal location in Westminster in London, and they're just doing a quick scan through this. What do you think, in terms of our offering for the business community? I mean, you've got a great understanding of what business space, and you were talking about it earlier. London Scottish House has got a massive development opportunity there to help startups. I'm particularly focusing on Scottish startups around the charitable side and ex-forces side. The flexible space, but there's ongoing restrictions. What would be your insight, Anne, for what offering in this new normal that we're still trying to get to grips with, within this space? And as Graham McWilliams spoke about earlier, maybe the space does have to be bigger to allow social distancing. What should be the offering for business community? Because we still want to do business with each other, and we may still want to operate in those types of environments. What would be an offering there, Anne, that you would be thinking about with your Santa Clara, Silicon Valley head on?
Well, That's an interesting question. So my first reaction is, I'm sorry. There's going to be much, much less requirement and interest and willingness for people to actually physically go to office spaces when they can conduct business by talking to each other in the way that we're doing here. Now, there's a maybe the best analogy is go look at what some of the museums are doing and the art galleries. They are putting on exhibits where you get a virtual experience of being in a very visually interesting environment. And I'd have to say that there's going to have to be a substantial repurposing. And I disagree with the guy who thinks there's going to have to be more space. What's going to happen is that people are going to want to be able to meet still, but in much smaller numbers. The era of having 300 people for a conference gone by. 2 years at least. Not going to be able to do it. Never mind much bigger meetings. And you need to look at ways of making use of virtuality, making use of offering people a remote experience. And I don't, on no notice, I don't know how the business model for that works out. I'm sorry, I don't know how you pay rent or taxes in a physical building where you don't have a short-term return from the people physically visiting the building. I think you're going to have to say, we need to plan for 2 years out. We need to plan for keeping the lights on, and we need to work out a different model that says that there's going to be the ability for people to come to the building, but to be inspected in the way that the Chinese have been doing for temperature or short-term or testing, so that people can interact much less. You're going to have to install elevator controls that you don't touch. The whole thing needs to be thought through so that there's a drastically different interaction model for a much smaller number of people at any one time.
Yeah. Anne, we're getting a lot of chat coming through, but I think when I sold this one to you, Anne, for an 8 a.m. start for you, I said, oh, don't worry, Anne, we'll be about 25 minutes. So apologies for this, but I'm going to let David Watt just have the last question, because I always like to end on a positive point. So David's asking, and David's former head of the IOD in Scotland, where, Anne, are the areas for growth? We've heard about the challenges going forward, but as your final feedback to us, where are the areas of growth and opportunity, Anne?
There's enormous opportunity in both infrastructure, computing infrastructure, networking infrastructure. There's going to be a big demand for upgrading people's last mile services for networking. And the other big space is going back to what I was saying about looking at who's doing well in the public market. Shopify, PayPal, TransferWise, everything to do with new ways of managing retail business where people are not in a retail place. Don't invest in shopping malls. Don't invest in physical space for doing business. Invest in ideas where people can receive goods. Amazon have hired another 125,000 people to accelerate the way that they actually deliver business. Marks and Spencer said that they were going to do 30-minute delivery for food. I don't see how they're going to manage 30-minute delivery for food. But any business where you have physical good dispersion, physical trading, and all of the communications and network and computing application infrastructure to support that trading. Those things are those things are exploding.
And it's been an absolute joy. We're 50 minutes in, and I know we could carry on for another 50 minutes, but you have a busy day ahead as we are coming to the end of our Tuesday afternoon. We've covered a lot of topics, Anne, and many we've just skimmed over. Is there anything that we haven't covered, Anne, that you would like to share with our community here?
So I know that Scotland has a rich history in gaming and online entertainment. That's another area where there's explosive growth going on, and there's lots of opportunity. It's a difficult business to be in, but if you look at Twitch, if you look at World of Warcraft, if you look at House Party, if you look at all these kinds of online interactive gaming, the whole entertainment world is changing. People, sports ball, tennis is cancelled, football is cancelled. I don't see that kind of thing coming back anytime soon, and certainly stadiums full of people aren't coming back. But stadiums full, the same number of people are getting together virtually to either play or watch other people playing. Fortnite, there's another company that's very well worthwhile paying attention to.
Yeah.
So that whole space we didn't talk about, but it's important. People need to watch it.
Yeah. Well, we'll maybe have you back for another session, Anne, because things are not going to change immediately. There's one, though, that I'll tell you to have a wee look at. I'll send you details on, because I know Chris is on the call, which is Spelfie, which is using satellites to zoom in on those attending events or not attending events, and how useful that will be in closed stadiums. So I'll send that link across there to you, Anne. And it's been an absolute joy, as always. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. And most importantly, thank you for your insights. I think we'll be coming back to you, Anne, at some point in the future. And until then, you and your husband stay safe and well. And we hope it's not too long before we see you back in Scotland. And take care.